Welcome to The Humble Podcaster, the podcast where we help you follow through on your dreams of creating your own show by providing practical knowledge, tips, and tricks on podcast production. One of the least understood, hardest to define factors in podcasting is what makes a follower a follower. As we discussed last week, there are a couple ways to define just what a follower is. At its most basic, a follower is a person who clicks the follow button on their podcast app of choice and receives all future notifications about your show and updates to their app's queue. This is a super helpful stat to have because it identifies the maximum number of people for a given app that can be attributed as followers. However, for this to be truly helpful, you need to be able to have every app provide this data, and as of the recording of this episode, that is just not the case. Sure, Apple and Spotify do it. That's a significant portion of your audience too, but it's not all. Those numbers also don't line up with download statistics. What's worse is that at the end of the day, those numbers are just a count of unique accounts who clicked a button. If you're familiar with email marketing, this is akin to the number of people on your email list. Not all of those people are going to read every newsletter you send out. You need to look at the open rate and the click-through rate to really get a sense for who's actually engaging with your content. Likewise, a basic follower is simply someone who is on the list. While it's great that they are there and they receive your content, what we really want when we look at followers are the people that are actively listening to your podcast. Now, we've already discussed active listeners in our last podcast, but in case you missed it, what we are looking for is an indication that we have people that are eagerly engaged with our content. The easiest marker for this is the download count after the first 24 hours of an episode being up. We average this over the past 3 episodes and keep a running number. The reason we use this instead of the basic follower count we get from our app is quite simply because not everyone that follows listens. And even if they do, we're still talking about at most maybe 2 or 3 apps that report out this data. But every podcast host can provide download data, making it the most democratized solution for tracking this number. So just what does a follower do beyond belong to a list and listen to your show on a consistent basis? This is an interesting stage because more often than not, followers are the silent majority of your show's base. You often don't hear from this group, but they are listening, and they will let you know when there's an error in your content. While this is in part to say stay focused on the details of your show, it's also to say engagement with followers is still key to growth. If you're notified of an error, let them know you're fixing it or at least aware of the issue. Take a positive, lighthearted approach to this feedback. They're not mad at you. They just want you to know they found something you can improve. Beyond that, followers need to be nurtured through the podcast itself. If you can involve them in some way with your show, it is strongly encouraged, as their involvement will not only bring more awareness to your show, but also generate more curious listeners for the content. Speaking from personal experience, anecdata, if you will, the shows I've become most invested in over the years are the ones that take this approach. I'm actually reminded of the first podcast I was ever on back in 2007. And yes, I've been doing podcasts for quite a while. A friend of mine had told me to check out a podcast called Letter to America. It was a podcast involving an American expatriate living in Ireland, and it was fun. Even back then, they did a lot to involve their audience. One thing they did was have listeners add their name to the listener map. They'd read out the names of new folks that added their name to the map every episode, make a comment or two, and move on. And I did this once. I added my name to the list, and it was cool. They recognized me, and I got really excited because, hey, Chris Hill is on this podcast, and you should check him out. And yeah, it was just really neat. Then, a while later, I found out the host was going to be near where I was going to college, and he was asking for tips on what to do in the area. So I pitched him on hanging out with me for a day, because why not? And going along and doing some very show-related activities. And to my amazement, he agreed. We had a blast. It was my first time ever being on a podcast. And I remember being amazed that this guy just showed up with a tiny recorder in his hands and recorded this entire podcast with me. And I was like, that's it? That's all it takes? How do I get into podcasting? Needless to say, after that adventure, I was hooked on the show. I shared the content with everyone I knew because I had guested on the show. And it was a crazy, surreal moment for me. Not only did it make me want to share the show with anyone that would listen, but it also inspired my lifelong passion for podcasting. And Jet, if you're out there listening, thank you for that experience. Now, I know that not every show is set up to where you can have listeners as guests. But what I'm getting at here is that you need to find ways to draw listeners in and make them feel involved in your show's production. There's a lot of ways you can do this. One way that I've seen work really well is having listeners do listener-read segues. It gives them a chance to identify themselves and to have their voice forever associated with an episode of the show. Astonishing Legends does this incredibly well if you're looking for a good example. If your podcast is more professional, you might not have need for voices on the air, unless you find a good guest in your audience, of course. But you can always get listener input, ask for emails with suggestions, and then act on or respond to the suggestions, crediting the listener for their input. Read off listener reviews, acknowledge errors, and credit the listener by name if they choose to be identified for catching those errors. You might also end up with listener-generated content, and if you do, find ways to highlight it in the appropriate medium. Could be on social media, could be on video, or directly on your podcast itself. What we're doing here is giving listeners an opportunity to be heard and highlighted on your show. This ultimately makes your content more shareable with their friends and their audience. It also gives you an opportunity to build a community. The more people talking about your show, the more likely someone will want folks to band together and talk about it. And eventually, if you don't start the community first, they will start one for you. So it's best that you get ahead of that group and start your own place for followers to congregate. Once you've started creating places for folks to congregate, be it on Reddit, Slack, Facebook groups, Patreon, or whatever flavor of private community you prefer, you've begun to convert followers into subscribers, and very likely, they'll quickly turn into true fans as well. We'll dive more into that in the next episode, of course, but it's worth mentioning here because we need to know where the path from follower to subscriber and true fan really begins. In this phase, I really feel like the most important thing you can do for your audience is find ways to draw them further into your show. Outside of podcast-specific engagement, don't forget that there is a myriad of ways you can get people engaged with your show on deeper levels using social media as well. Live streaming your content is one great example of this. If you're comfortable building your content in public, this is a great way to engage with those folks. There are multiple platforms that can be used for this, and I recommend you start by finding the ones where you have the biggest audience and engaging there first. Video content is another way to reach listeners where they're at. Even if you don't want to post full videos of your content to YouTube, having recorded videos of yourself and your guests talking make for great promotional material. And also, as you're probably aware, YouTube is working on ways to incorporate podcasting into their platform. So the more you can do to start getting your content in line with them, the better off you'll be. And the same goes for TikTok too, by the way. Lastly, there's always good old social media. Doing an Ask Me Anything or AMA or something else that puts you in front of your audience online is a great way to draw people into your show. The advantage to content like this is that it also attracts curious and explorer stage listeners as well. And the content can be expanded to engage subscribers and true fans as you add different levels of access to your content. Exclusive events, private content, backstage stuff, bloopers, what have you. Once you've got an audience together, it's important to keep their attention. Engaging followers and finding ways to get them to continue to come back to your work week in and week out is tough, especially when you can only identify them as a rough estimate of numbers and not real people. Of course, that's the beauty of social media, right? We can start talking to people as if they're numbers and letters, like Big Pod Lover 420. But let's be frank, we need more than that. We need to know people for who they are. Full name with no numbers. And to do that, we need people who not only follow the work we do, but subscribe to it. And we'll talk about that when we discuss the subscriber stage in our next episode. Thank you for listening to The Humble Podcaster. You can keep up with the latest on the podcast at humblepodcaster.com and be sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to connect with us on social media, you can find us at HumblePod on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And remember, stay humble,
stay on course, and keep on podcasting. This has been a Humble Pod production. Stay humble.